Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome. I am so excited today because we have nominees for MDDC's prestigious Rookie of the Year Award. 3 of our 5 nominees are joining us today. So let's get started and have them introduce. We'll have you introduce yourself, and then we'll talk about what Rookie of the Year actually is. So, Greg, you're first up in my vision. Why don't we start with you and then go to Annie and Maggie?
Hey, so I'm Greg Morton. I'm a data reporter at the Baltimore Banner. I've worked there since about September of last year.
Wow. Okay. So you're coming up on like 6 months, right? Is that
Yeah.
wow, exciting. Okay, Annie, tell us about you.
Hi, I'm Annie. I'm a data reporter for the Baltimore Sun, and I just hit my 1 year mark at the Sun on April 3rd.
Well, happy anniversary. That's wonderful. All right, Maggie, what about you?
Maggie. I am a reporter at the Star Democrat newspaper Easton, and I also write for the Dorchester Mail and Carriage. And I am I'm coming on a year in June. June 12th will be a year, so.
Okay, so you guys are really like plunged into this industry. So the Rookie of the Year award is something that MDDC bestows every year, and it recognizes an early in career journalist. You have to have been nominated by your publication, and so that's sort of an honor in and of itself. But B, nominees cannot have been in working as a professional journalist for longer than 18 months. So it really is identifying students, or not students, but early in career journalists of great promise. And it's always so exciting to see the nomination letters. And don't worry, you'll get your nomination letter so you can see all the good things that people say about you. But since everyone's coming up either on their year or just in the last couple months, I wanted to start. You're kind of coming fresh into this industry, perhaps full of idealism, and it's not an easy industry sometimes. And so, what made you decide to become a journalist? And why don't we start with Annie, and then you all can sort of pop in.
Yeah, so when I was in high school, I had this kind of assignment for a class that involved doing like a written article, profile, and that's really whenever I fell in love with like learning, like becoming an expert on a new topic. Um, like on a daily basis and getting to do that for a living. Um, so that's really what made me fall in love with like doing journalism. And then data journalism kind of came a little bit later for me in the last year of my undergraduate degree was like the height of COVID, and I learned about the importance of like data and numbers with that. So that's how I got into data journalism specifically.
I love that, and sort of that idea of becoming an expert in a topic. There's not many professions where you are kind of creating something totally out of nothing every day or multiple times a day, and really becoming an expert to be able to teach it. So that's terrific. Maggie, what about you?
So it's kind of similar. I was on my high school newspaper, and my junior year of high school, I had an opportunity to go to Morocco for a class trip, which is kind of crazy. And we, toward the end of the trip, they brought in, it was like an organized trip, and they brought in people, just residents who had to talk with the government. And I was never, in high school, I was never someone who like raised hands to ask questions all this time. I wasn't a huge talker. And I was so fascinated, and I just kept on asking questions. I think that was kind of the point that I think when I really like this, and I had been trying to write to the newspaper, my high school newspaper, and I've been doing it ever since.
Oh, I love that. And it's often said that if you want to know what's going, like, you always sit next to a journalist at the party because they always know what's going on. So, Greg, what brings you to journalism?
So I think journalism is fun because I think it combines two of my favorite things, which are research and storytelling. So
Hmm.
my background was I was an econ major in undergrad, and I always knew I wanted to do research in some form. But I think the thing that frustrated me about that is it was hard to make econ research like actionable for people's
Mm,
lives,
sure.
and it was hard to make an immediate impact with the kind of detailed, meticulous, peer-reviewed research that I enjoy doing, but was like totally incomprehensible to like 95% people, or 95% people didn't want to engage with it or whatever. So journalism gave me a chance, like number one, to do the same kind of stuff in a way that is more accessible to people
Hmm.
and that people can it can make a real difference in people's lives, right? Whether that's through like the kind of impact that we're going for, when we publish a big story or just teaching somebody about something new. And it's like a fun chance to like tell stories about people's lives and to hear stories about people's lives. Like I think one of my favorite things about being a journalist is just the idea that, we spend a decent amount of our time just calling people up and asking them about the stuff that they do. And like I think how cool that is not lost on me, and it's like one of the main reasons I love doing this job. You get to hear so much interesting stuff from so many interesting people, and you put that together into something that hopefully can be like useful to people.
Yeah. No, and I totally agree. I mean, and that kind of leads me to to a topic that I wanted to bring up about this sort of idea of information overload. Like, there's so much information out there. And when you look at, and I feel really lucky that we have two data journalists here with us, because all that information is really interesting and important, and you can see these really large trends. But if you can't distill it down into a story that someone can relate to, it's it's not that it's useless, it's just not very effective. And so I love that about what draws you in, Greg. And I wanted to ask you guys, like, about that information overload, because as a young journalist, I feel like you're you have to be facile in all the channels. It can get overwhelming. There's a lot of inputs, and issues are complex. So, can you talk to me about how you kind of juggle, all of the duties that come along with being a journalist and all of the sort of goals that you're trying to reach? What does that feel like on the day to day?
It's hard. uh, it's hard, and I think this is I think it's one of the hardest parts about stepping into like a full time job like this for the first time, right? Especially on a beat like data, where it's like we're working with different parts of the newsroom, and we're not really married to any specific topic or like a specific beat in the same way that an education reporter is, or a criminal justice reporter is. Um, so I think with that, at least for me, comes like a lot of freedom in terms of what I get to take on, right? And the amount of projects that are available to me to work on at a given time. Um, but I think it's also, this is the importance of like having a good editor and good infrastructure. Like it's also about, I think one of the hardest parts is uh, just deciding what you think is worth it to work on and then committing to that, right?
Mm,
I think that's probably one of the hardest parts of the job for me.
yeah, yeah. Maggie? It looks like you're about to say
I was
something.
going to say, I think that there's overlap with doing journalism and just being a reporter at a small newspaper where you're kind of like I'm covering local governments, I'm covering education, I'm covering private courts. So juggling all of that is not easy, and I think it's hard to know when to stop. And it's great that I have kind of some freedom and being able to do all of these things. Um, but it can be hard, and having to stop at the end of the day and say this is all that I can do and I'm doing it to the most of this while I can. It can be difficult, but there is something really cool about being able to do all of it and kind of try to hands out all of these different things.
Yeah. So, and I want to stop here for a moment and welcome Braden Hamelin, who is another one of our nominees for Rookie of the Year. Braden, we're talking about sort of juggling everything. We were talking a little bit about data, but just sort of managing the job. But first, can you introduce yourself, where your publication, and maybe how long you've been there?
Yeah. So sorry I'm late. Speaking of that topic, I had an interview run a little bit long. Um, and yeah, so I work at Mid Atlantic Media, which is a publication in Columbia. Um, and we do, a bunch of various things. We do parenting. I mainly work on the Washington Jewish Week, which is a weekly Jewish publication in the area. And I've been there since start of September. So
Great.
yeah.
All right. So everybody's kind of in that same boat of early on. And Annie, what do you think about that overload idea? Is there, I mean, because you're seeing it from, I don't know, in your world if you're sort of free ranging throughout the newsroom like Greg is, but what does that look like for you?
Yeah, yeah. It is kind of similar with like working with so many different beats, and it is a lot of different story ideas and topics going on at one time. Um, I think for me, one thing I think a lot about, I do some like social media work as well. And so a big thing in that overlap between like data and social media is like in a world of so much information, making sure that like the things I produce um, are won't like fly out into the world of social media and be taken out of context.
Mm.
Like a lot of times, like data visualizations often go viral for something it's saying without context. So it's something I try to focus on a lot in my work.
I think that's so interesting, and just it reminds me of a bill that just came out of Maryland's legislature about deep fakes in the election cycle, and the preponderance of AI. And I think some of the changes that are coming about for journalism is that like that relationship of trust with readers is really at the center. So the readers are always at the center, but the trust relationship is just becoming more and more important as there are more avenues for misinformation. So, what, and I'm curious, like you all have come into this industry. Do you, is it what you thought it would be? I mean, you come in sometimes when you're in school, there's a lot of, theoreticals or esoteric ideas of like, okay, well, this is journalism. This is what it's like. How has that carried through into what you're doing, and is it accurate? Um, Braden, do you have something to share on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I went to the University of Maryland, fantastic journalism program there. I think they prepared us really well for what the like experience would be like for me as a print journalist. I think it's very close to what the reality of everything is. Um, Fact checking, most importantly, making sure you're not getting misled by sources, you know, uncovering agendas that people have when they're talking to you, and making sure not to incorporate that into your writing, at least without recognition of it. Scheduling interviews that so I think there was a lot of great preparation that we did there that really gave an accurate portrayal of what the job would be like. It's obviously slightly different with day to day inconveniences, working just a job in general that you can't prepare for in college, but I think it's as close as they could have gotten it.
That's great to hear, and it always comes as such a shock to the system when you have to put in your 40 a week, coming right out of school. Like I too remember, wow, that's different. What about everyone else? Was it truth in advertising, from your academic experience? Maggie, what do you think?
I came from the University of Missouri J School, and we had a newspaper that I wrote for the newspaper. It was a local newspaper, so and some education there. And so I think that it's very, very similar. I think that this is now like I just said, like full-time job. and it's a little bit crazier, but at the core, I think the things that I learned there, the things that I did there are like the same things I'm doing here. So that was helpful. I felt very prepared when I came into this job.
Yeah, yeah. And I see nods from Greg and Annie. Anything to add there?
Yeah, I pretty much agree. I also came through University of Maryland, the grad program, and I think they left us pretty uniquely well positioned, especially to go into data journalism jobs because there's such a
Mm.
strong data infrastructure in place. So I think that combined with interning on like very well running functional data teams before this is one of those things that has like helped me like get a sense of like what's normal, but
Mm.
also to like decide which processes we should be putting in place, and what stuff that I should be doing day to day to make sure that we're moving forward and being successful.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add, Annie?
Yeah, I think along the same lines, I also went to the University of Missouri, and I feel very similarly about being like prepared and doing like kind of the same processes. But one thing I think that has changed based on like when I was in college versus now is probably like different ways that audiences like get news, which has been interesting to adapt to like in the first year. Like TikTok, I think didn't become really big until I was almost done with college, and now like TikTok has been a part like of my job early career, and like adapting to that and knowing like when to adapt to different outlets like that is interesting.
I think that's a really like salient point because there's a proliferation of all these news channels, and there's only but so many hours in the day and capacity and so forth. So, do you all have the? What do you all feel is are some of the best ways to connect with readers? Annie, you talked about TikTok, but are we now the TikTok news, or are there other areas that you think are really helpful?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a one like best way, and if there is, I would love to hear about it. But there's like, oh, I think that social media is a great way to like interact with audiences. Um, and I think there's becoming like an increasing amount of unique ways people are doing that, even with like I've seen people like reintroduce print journalism on TikTok, which has been really interesting to see. Because like Gen Z is learning like, oh, print newspapers are cool, which I really love. But I think platforms like TikTok, Reddit have really great opportunities to like ask questions and actually engage with people.
Hmm.
I
What are
wish
the
we
rest
were the TikTok news.
it could be the next big thing. Um, and actually, does the banner have a TikTok channel or?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I think TikTok is actually one of our stronger avenues for like getting readers into our stories, right? Krishna does like an incredible job with our TikTok, and it's one of my favorite ways to like consume our stories and know what's on our website. But I think it's also goes to show it goes to show that people are consuming these stories differently, and right, he has such a different relationship with our readers than those of us who are just publishing stuff online, or those of us who are just writing words.
Mhm.
So it's like it's yeah, it's a fun way to engage with people.
Yeah. And so, like Washington Jewish Week, are you on the TikTok train and Stardem or do your readers want different things? Because I think when you put readers at the center and you're trying to engage with them in different ways, that'll show up differently. So tell us more about how you all interact.
Yeah. So with us, I know I somebody suggested it at one point, but like I think our readership base is on the older side,
Mhm.
and what we have been told through like our research and our data is that they really prefer the physical print newspapers that we produce every week, and that's the main way that we get like our dedicated reader base and disseminate information to them because we have a website. We auto load stuff onto Twitter and Facebook and stuff like that, but the most popular way that to my understanding is still the physical newspaper.
Yeah. Yeah.
Same for us, kind of. I think Facebook is where our readers are, so that's what we use, and that's also, I'm in so many Facebook groups. but we have not gotten to Twitter or TikTok on the Eastern Shore.
It'll happen, and I feel like there's news is ever evolving. Like in my role at the press association, sometimes we get, I think people get hung up on format more often, and where we really should be talking about journalism, like the act of journalism. And so oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I thought I was interrupting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of acts of journalism and sort of what you have this really unique view of the industry. You're coming in, you have a little town polish, you've had some professional experience, and you have each of you feels really well prepared for the job that you're doing. So where do you see where do you see journalism heading? How can journalism, which sometimes seems like the broccoli of the world in terms of like media consumption. How do you how do you make it where do you see journalism going, or how do you feel like it can stay relevant? Because there's so many there's so many studies that show when local journalism declines, incidents of corruption increase. When small businesses fail more, there are real material effects to the loss of local journalism, but it's also sometimes hard for people to, like, just the general public, to say, okay, this matters to me, because I get my news online, not realizing that it comes from people like you. So that's a really long introduction to asking you what you think is where journalism needs to head. Who feels called on that one?
That's a hard question.
It
Um,
is.
I, I mean, I think for me, at least, like, I think the stuff that I'm focused on for the future is like making journalism like fun and easy to consume without
Mhm.
like sacrificing content, right? I think one of the unique things that we get to do as data journalists is like build interactives and um, give people facts in a way that is like interesting and fun to play with and fun to scroll through on your phone and easy to consume and easy to share with friends and stuff like that. So I think I'd like to do more interesting, robust uh, versions of that. Um, and I think we have other stuff to do to make journalism easier to consume as well. Like I think having more stuff on audio is good for accessibility. Publishing more stuff in other languages is great for accessibility. Making sure that we're not so married to either process or format that we're alienating people from the good information that we spend our time reporting on.
Hmm. Yeah. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Where you see things heading, or where you'd like to concentrate your energies?
Yeah, I think I'd like to see journalism heading in a direction that's more of meeting people where they are. And I think there's a lot of newsrooms doing that work. Um, but there's definitely like work to be done on getting to more audience, like wider audiences than we're getting to now.
Annie, could you talk a little bit more about that? Because that kind of like ties into some of the discussions that have been happening industry wide about underserved populations, or how we can, and sort of that idea of like mainstream news is not covering the things that different communities want. Can you talk a little bit more about what you see there?
Mhm. Yeah, I think one of the main barriers I always think about is like the idea of like subscription models and paywalls. So I think there's a lot of work that newsrooms can be doing to ensuring that like people can get access to news beyond that, and outside of the paywall. Um, I think ways some people have done that is like social media. Um, I've seen some people do like outreach into specific neighborhoods and communities where they think that their news is not getting to and needs to be. And that can be in the form of like journalists actually going and like sitting down and talking to people, just about story ideas or just talking in general. there's like so many ways that I think people can do that, but I would like to see more like institutional versions of that in the future.
I love the idea of the listening tours and really embedding in communities and finding out, well, what do you think is important to cover? Because, a lot of times in readership surveys and things like that, you find out what the people who already read you want to know. So I think there's doing that gap analysis is a really interesting idea. Maggie or Braden, what do you think about sort of reaching out to wider populations and where things should be?
But I think what Annie said, I very much agree with. And like, one of my goals as I've been a new reporter in a new place, because I moved here from the Midwest, has been really when I am out in the community and talking to people, giving them my card, which is kind of old school, but that's the Eastern Shore, and really making sure that I am making inroads and connecting with people in the community and trying to talk to them as much as I can and meet with them. I think that um, is important in just having a variety of people that you know, so you can figure out what those problems are and what their um, concerns and things that they care about are. And so that's, I guess, easier said than done. That isn't always the easiest thing, but I think that's a really important part of our jobs.
Mm-hmm. No, and I do feel like people in general feel like they don't know a journalist, because the industry has shrunk some, and but if you do know a journalist, then you're really much more understanding of the role of news and what happens. And so, and getting out in that community is such an interesting way to go about that. Braden, anything to add?
Yeah, I think also for print, one of the most important things is trying to reach like you guys have already mentioned this a little bit, but I think reaching new audiences, especially coming from like our context where we have, a very dedicated reader base. I think for print overall and for other papers like ours, it's important to try and find that new audience and connect with them. And like you said, with the readership surveys, you'll figure out what your readers who are already your readers want to read. I think finding out what, your larger community that may include underserved populations or people that just haven't ever connected to your news, what they want to hear about and stories that'll interest them so that you don't have generations or groups of people who don't feel connected to the news, don't feel connected to reporters, and don't have any incentive to read or care about what you're writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it always sort of, because people, there's ebbs and flows there. You need to always increase your reach and your angle. And I think it's so important to understand what people really want. Um, I wanted to turn now to things that you want. So, as early in career journalists, there are mentors, there are people that are bringing you along, and so I wanted to um, better understand kind of the role, like the ecosystem. So, you've had people either taking you under their wing or maybe showing you different things. How has that affected your reporting and your roles? Have you had a mentor? Are you learning kind of from your community within the newsroom? And what does that look like?
I think I have a really good example of this. Working largely for a Jewish newspaper, I'm not Jewish myself, so my editor has been absolutely fantastic, and like really helped me like learn this role, learn this community, and has taught me a lot of stuff that made my job 10 times easier, connecting with the community, being able to write, and also just how to, in general, outside of the Jewish aspect, to communicate with sources,
Mm-hmm.
help me contact people, get in touch with people, and really setting up contacts that will and have helped me a ton already. So really
Yeah.
appreciate all the work that he's done.
And that makes perfect sense because you guys have really kind of, in some ways, parachuted into a community in a space that you might not have been familiar with. Like Maggie, you came from the Midwest. Tell us a little bit about your sort of entry path into doing
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, no, it's actually different. And it was, I have a really great news. great colleagues, and that has helped a lot. And even the colleagues that are no longer in the newsroom and they're typically no longer my colleagues, they're still always there. And one of them, I'm going to call it a little bit to ask for some help on some background information for things. So having that newsroom with people who have that knowledge, they've been there for a long time, either they grew up on Ladies Mentor or they've been at the paper for a couple of years, that has helped a lot. I think that local news, I think, is local news everywhere. Like, there are definitely similarities, and I grew up in Chicago, so I come from a big city, but if you're coming from a big city, I see similarities between Chicago and Cambridge. So there's, it's not been as hard as it could be, I think. I think that I have kind of been able to um, really get into the community through my colleagues and just through my background in doing local news at college level.
I love that. And I do find that even journalists who aren't necessarily professional journalists any longer are so willing to share their expertise and their insight. And it's a very such an interesting mix of people because I feel like they'd cut you for a scoop any day, but yet they'd also really support what you're doing as well. So it's an interesting mix. Greg or Annie, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. I think I'm super grateful, and I think one of the things that is super important when you're working in data journalism is like having good mentors to show you what process looks like. I think that becomes super important in our jobs because, like, frankly, there's not a lot of people in a lot of newsrooms who like understand the day to day of what we do. So, I'm grateful for all the people in my life. I'll shout out Derek Willis, who's one of my professors at UMD. Uh, um, Megan Hoyer, who was my editor when I was an intern at the Washington Post, Ryan Jones, who was my editor when I was an intern at ProPublica. Like all of these people were so important in my path because they showed me the basics of things like how to set up a project, how to like carry forth an investigation, how to make sure that your work is reproducible, how to explain this stuff to non-data people. Like all of that stuff has become so like integral to like my day-to-day job, and I wouldn't have gotten it without like the human connection that I have with these people. And frankly, I don't think I would be able to do this job like if I had never met any of them. So, I think that's super important, and I take the responsibility of like carrying forth that institutional knowledge and making sure that we're imparting that in other people super seriously as part of my job.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that. And it is, it kind of takes that village and no one gets where they are just by magic. It's hard work, but it's also the people around you. So it's wonderful to hear. Annie, anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to echo like what Greg said about the importance of learning the um processes from mentors and stuff with data journalism. Um, Another thing is just how grateful I am for the people, like all of the reporters I work with. Because I'm sure this is something everyone can resonate with moving to a new area, but like since I'm not an expert on like the environment or health, I'm constantly asking like somewhat silly questions to people and like when understanding a data set, and they are so helpful, and I just not being afraid to ask those dumb questions like is really helpful.
There are no dumb questions for sure. Because everybody starts from where they are, and what you said earlier about meeting your readers where they are. That happens for people in the industry as well. We want to make sure that everyone's coming up and giving their full potential. So as we wind down, I wanted to center in you what advice you'd give to the next generation of rookie of the years. You all, the nominees, you all will be kind of aging out of, you can't be a rookie twice. So you have this sort of unique precipice that you're on. So when you think about students and journalists that are coming after you, what advice or what would you like to tell them? Doesn't have to be advice, but what would you like to tell them? Anyone want to go first?
I think the most important thing is take care of yourself. Make sure you take care of your mental health. This is the time in your career where you're really starting to like establish habits and establish what like a day to day looks like. And I think it's really important to like prioritize your well-being when you are setting that stuff up. Because it's very, very easy. Like people will work you really, really hard, especially if you're good at your job, like everybody on this call is. So I think it's important to be to safeguard your own like well-being and make sure that you prioritize that, um, over maybe sometimes being the fastest or doing the 110% best version or whatever. I think taking care of your mental health is so important because that's how you stay in journalism long term.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I do feel like this is an industry. I mean, news happens all the time and the cycle is 24 hours. You could be there for all of it, but you won't be here for the long haul. So like definitely keeping, understanding where your limits are and what you can do and what you can't do. Pacing yourself is really important. So thank you for that. Who else wants to? Annie, you're next on my screen. Do you want to provide your insider advice?
Yeah, I think one piece of advice I wasn't given before, but I think as I like joined, like got my first job, I think one thing is like not to be afraid to challenge things, in a polite way, of course, but like if you are questioning something or why someone is doing something, like there people will open up conversations about that. And um yeah, any like great editors are willing to like listen to you and talk it through.
Sort of that idea of the reporter is always asking questions, and as an industry we have to ask questions of ourselves. We have to kind of internally report in some way. So I love that as a piece of advice. Braden, what do you think? And then Maggie will bring us home.
Yeah. I really want to reiterate heavily what Greg said about, taking care of yourself, because that's like one of the most important things to continue to love doing what we do. And, if you start to not have a routine or fall out of it, that can, kind of take you down a little bit. And also to make sure that you know that you like what you're doing, before you start something and commit to something and move, hundreds of miles away, if that's what you're doing. um, Make sure you know that it's something that you will be passionate about, because it's not always easy. And so if it's something that you don't like, then you're not going to have a good time and you're going to really burn out fast.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That it's always good to make sure to know oneself first before you jump in. Maggie, what do you think?
I'm thinking back off of like a Braden and say set your limits at the very beginning. When you start, set your limits of this is what I'm gonna do, this is what I'm gonna stop. Because when it hits those end, that's like it needs to have those limits in place that hopefully you can stick with them. Uh, and then I would also just say as we're don't just talk to the government officials. Get out, talk to the residents. I think that's like something that sometimes we forget to do because they're not the important people. But I think that that is where our best stories come from are the people. And so remembering that I think is important.
I love that, putting that the people in the center. And so, okay, we've heard self-care, boundaries, question authority, and question everyone. Sort of reach out beyond your borders. And so I feel like this has been such a great conversation to hear your perspectives. I'm so excited to meet all of our nominees. It really is quite a big deal to be a nominee for Rookie of the Year. Can't wait to find out who our big winner is on May 3rd. But you're all such a wonderful, each of you is a wonderful complement and addition to news journalism in this area. And I really thank you for taking the time to come and talk to me today.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.